Hey guys, welcome to another Atlas Archives exploration, where tonight we're venturing to one of the world's most strategically valuable pieces of real estate that most people couldn't find on a map if their Wi-Fi password depended on it. We're heading to Djibouti, a country so small you could drive across it in 2 hours, yet so important that half the world's major powers have decided to set up military bases there, creating what locals probably call the world's most expensive neighborhood. Tonight, we'll uncover how 23,000 square kilometers of seemingly harsh desert became the Horn of Africa's most coveted address, hosting everyone from French foreign legionnaires to American Marines to Chinese naval forces, sometimes all within walking distance of each other. It's a story of strategic brilliance, political tightrope walking, and the remarkable ability to make necessity the mother of very profitable invention. Drop a comment letting us know where you're listening from, and if you're finding these deep dives as fascinatingly sleep-inducing as intended, hit that subscribe button to ensure you never miss another journey through history's hidden gems. So, settle in, get comfortable, and prepare to discover how Djibouti became the Switzerland of strategic military real estate, except with significantly more camels and considerably fewer fondue restaurants. Chapter 1: A Tiny Giant, Introduction and Ancient Origins. Picture this. You're looking at a map of Africa, and there, nestled in the Horn like a small but perfectly placed puzzle piece, sits Djibouti. It's roughly the size of New Jersey, which means you could fit it into Texas about 30 times over. Though let's be honest, everything fits into Texas about 30 times over. But what this little country lacks in size, it more than makes up for in sheer audacity and historical significance. Welcome to Djibouti, a nation so strategically important that it makes up for its modest 23,000 square kilometers by basically controlling one of the world's most crucial shipping lanes. It's like being the bouncer at the most exclusive club on earth, except the club is the Red Sea, and everyone from ancient Egyptian pharaohs to modern cargo ships has been trying to get through this particular door for millennia. Djibouti sits at the mouth of the Red Sea, where it meets the Gulf of Aden, controlling access through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. The name Bab el-Mandeb translates to Gate of Tears, which sounds ominous until you realize it probably refers to the tears of joy from sailors finally reaching calmer waters after navigating some particularly choppy seas. Though knowing maritime history, it could just as easily refer to the tears of frustration from trying to navigate bureaucratic port procedures. The country is shaped rather like the letter C, if that letter C had been drawn by someone with particularly strong opinions about harbours. It cradles the Gulf of Tadjoura, which opens into the Gulf of Aden like a perfectly designed natural harbour that seems almost too good to be accidental. This geographical blessing has made Djibouti the ultimate middleman for thousands of years. Not the annoying kind of middleman who adds unnecessary fees, but the genuinely useful kind who knows exactly where everything is and how to get it there safely. Bordered by Eritrea to the north, Ethiopia to the west and southwest, and Somalia to the south, Djibouti occupies what geologists cheerfully describe as one of the most geologically active places on Earth. 3 tectonic plates meet here, the Arabian, Nubian, and Somali plates, creating a landscape that looks like it was designed by someone with a particular fondness for dramatic geological features and a complete disregard for architectural stability. The terrain varies from jagged volcanic mountains in the north to flat coastal plains that stretch along the Red Sea. Mount Musa Ali stands as the country's highest peak at 2,028 meters above sea level, while Lake Assal sits 155 meters below sea level, making it the lowest point in Africa and quite possibly the only place where you can experience altitude sickness from going downhill. Lake Assal deserves its own paragraph because it's essentially nature's version of a quirky science experiment that got completely out of hand. It's 10 times saltier than the ocean, which means it makes the Dead Sea look like a freshwater swimming pool. The lake glows an ethereal blue colour that would look completely artificial if you saw it in a photograph, surrounded by volcanic hills that appear to have been arranged by a particularly artistic geologist with excellent taste in dramatic landscapes. The climate, to put it diplomatically, is challenging. Djibouti experiences what meteorologists tactfully describe as a hot desert climate, though locals might prefer terms that are considerably more colourful. Temperatures regularly soar above 40 degrees Celsius during the day, leading early travellers to christen it the Hell of Africa. This designation inspired a Somali proverb that advises, "Before crossing this country, even the jackal writes his will," which suggests that even the region's most adaptable predators approach Djibouti with considerable respect. Yet this harsh environment has been home to humans for an extraordinarily long time. Archaeological evidence suggests that our ancestors have been calling this challenging landscape home for millions of years, which either speaks to remarkable human adaptability or suggests that our ancestors had a very different definition of prime real estate. The earliest evidence of human presence dates back approximately 3 million years, discovered around Lake Abbey in the form of cut stones that represent some of humanity's earliest attempts at tool-making. These weren't sophisticated instruments by any means, more like prehistoric versions of, "I need to crack open this nut, and this rock looks promising." But they represent the beginning of a long tradition of humans making the best of challenging circumstances. More substantial evidence emerges from around 1.4 million years BCE, when the remains of a Paleoloxodon reki elephant were discovered in the Gobard Plain, showing clear signs of having been butchered using basalt tools. The elephant, which was considerably larger than its modern relatives, had been systematically processed by what archaeologists believe were Homo ergaster individuals. This suggests not only that early humans were successfully hunting massive game animals, but that they were organized enough to completely process a creature the size of a small building. The archaeological site at Gomborta, excavated in the 1990s, revealed an Acheulean settlement dating from 800,000 to 400,000 years BCE. Here, archaeologists found evidence of sophisticated stone tool production, indicating that early humans weren't just surviving in this challenging environment, they were developing increasingly complex technologies. The tools discovered at Gomborta show a level of craftsmanship that suggests these weren't desperate survivors scraping by, but established communities with enough stability to develop specialized skills. What makes these early settlements particularly remarkable is the climate they experienced. Until approximately 4,000 years BCE, the region enjoyed a climate described by researchers as probably close to Mediterranean, which means it was considerably more hospitable than the furnace-like conditions that characterize modern Djibouti. This ancient climate supported a much richer ecosystem, with evidence of forests, grasslands, and abundant wildlife. During this more temperate period, the region became part of what ancient civilizations knew as Punt, or Ta Net Jeru, meaning God's land in ancient Egyptian. The Land of Punt has captured imaginations for millennia, appearing in Egyptian records as a source of exotic goods and mysterious wealth. Queen Hatshepsut's famous expedition to Punt around 1500 BCE brought back such marvels as incense trees, gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animals that amazed the Egyptian court. The Puntites weren't just passive suppliers of exotic goods, they were sophisticated traders who understood the value of their strategic location. Archaeological evidence suggests they traded not only their own products, but also served as intermediaries for goods from throughout the Horn of Africa and beyond. They dealt in frankincense and myrrh, which were literally worth their weight in gold in the ancient world, making Punt the ancient equivalent of controlling the global spice trade. The relationship between Punt and ancient Egypt was remarkably long-lasting, with records showing trade connections spanning more than 1,000 years. Egyptian reliefs at Deir el-Bahari depict the land of Punt as ruled by King Parahu and Queen Ati, showing distinctive circular houses built on stilts and populated by people who clearly understood both the value of good ventilation and the importance of staying above flood level. These ancient traders established patterns that would define the region for millennia, serving as a crucial link between Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and the wider world. The same geographical advantages that made Punt valuable to ancient Egypt would later attract Islamic traders, European colonizers, and modern military strategists. Sometimes the best business plan really is just having the right address. The transition from the green, temperate landscape of ancient Punt to the arid environment of today occurred gradually over thousands of years. As the climate changed, so did the human societies that called this region home. The lush forests gave way to scattered vegetation, abundant rivers became seasonal wadis, and the lifestyle of the inhabitants adapted accordingly. The Neolithic site at Wakrita, dating to around 2000 BCE, provides a glimpse of this transitional period. Excavations revealed abundant ceramics and evidence of a sophisticated society that balanced fishing, cattle herding, and goat husbandry. The inhabitants of Wakrita lived during a period when Lake Abe was considerably larger and more hospitable than today, supporting fishing communities that also maintained substantial herds of livestock. What's particularly fascinating about the Wakrita site is that it represents some of the earliest evidence of herding in the region. The inhabitants weren't just fishing and gathering, they were actively managing livestock, which requires significant social organization and long-term planning. You can't just decide to become a herder on a whim. It requires understanding of seasonal patterns, grazing management, and the complex social structures necessary to manage communal resources. As the climate continued to change, the inhabitants of what would become Djibouti developed the nomadic lifestyles that would characterize the region for thousands of years. These weren't aimless wanderers, but sophisticated societies with complex understanding of seasonal patterns, water sources, and the movements of both wild game and domestic livestock. The linguistic evidence suggests that during this period, the first Afro-Asiatic-speaking populations either arrived in the region from the Nile Valley or developed their languages in situ. The Afro-Asiatic language family includes modern Somali, Afar, Arabic, and ancient Egyptian, suggesting deep historical connections that span millennia and continents. It's like discovering that your neighborhood has been the crossroads of the ancient world all along, which, in Djibouti's case, is exactly what happened. The region's importance was further enhanced by its position along what archaeologists call the southern coastal route, one of the primary pathways used by early humans migrating from Africa to the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, at only 25 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, provided a crucial bridge between continents. During periods of lower sea level, this crossing would have been even easier, making Djibouti a literal gateway between Africa and Asia. This strategic position meant that Djibouti wasn't just home to local populations, it was a crossroads where different cultures, technologies, and ideas met and mingled. Archaeological evidence shows influences from Africa, Arabia, and beyond, creating a unique cultural blend that would characterize the region throughout its history. The arrival of Islam in the 7th century CE would mark the end of our ancient period, but the patterns established during these early millennia, strategic trading position, cultural mixing, and adaptation to challenging environmental conditions, would continue to define Djibouti's character through all the changes that followed. As we conclude this exploration of Djibouti's ancient origins, it's worth reflecting on the remarkable continuity of human presence in this challenging but strategically crucial location. For millions of years, human societies have recognized the value of this small territory at the mouth of the Red Sea. From the earliest toolmakers around Lake Abyei to the sophisticated traders of ancient Punt, the inhabitants of Djibouti have consistently punched above their weight, leveraging geographical advantage into historical significance. The geological forces that shape this landscape continue to this day, making Djibouti one of the most seismically active places on Earth. Over 600 tremors occur annually, though virtually none are felt by residents who have grown accustomed to living on what geologists cheerfully describe as one of the most tectonically interesting places on the planet. The most recent volcanic eruption occurred in 1978, when the Ardukoba volcano erupted with spectacular lava flows that attracted volcanologists from around the world. The eruption was accompanied by tremendous seismic activity that actually widened the gap between the African and Arabian plates by more than a meter, providing scientists with a real-time demonstration of continental drift in action. This ongoing geological activity has created a landscape that seems almost alien in its stark beauty. The Danakil Depression, which extends into Djibouti from neighbouring Ethiopia, represents one of the few places on Earth where you can observe the ocean floor without getting wet. Here, the Earth's crust is being pulled apart, creating a rift that will eventually become a new ocean, though this process will take several million years, considerably longer than most urban planning projects. The tiny nation that would eventually emerge from this ancient foundation would inherit not just a strategic location, but a deep tradition of adaptation, trade, and cultural synthesis that had been developing for millennia. In many ways, modern Djibouti's role as a hub for international military bases and global shipping represents the latest chapter in a story that began with our earliest ancestors, recognizing that sometimes the best place to be is exactly where everyone else needs to go. Chapter 2. When Empires Knocked on Djibouti's Door. If you've ever had uninvited guests who showed up, made themselves comfortable, rearranged your furniture, and then refused to leave, you'll have some understanding of what happened to Djibouti between the 10th and 19th centuries. Except these guests were armed with swords, came bearing religious texts, and had very strong opinions about trade routes. And instead of eating all your snacks, they fundamentally transformed the entire cultural and political landscape of the Horn of Africa. The story begins in the 7th century, shortly after the Hijra, the migration of Prophet Muhammad and his followers from Mecca to Medina in 622 CE. While the Islamic faith was taking root in the Arabian Peninsula, merchants and missionaries were spreading across the Red Sea to establish communities along the African coast. They were essentially the medieval equivalent of very persuasive door-to-door salesmen offering a complete spiritual and social reform package. The port city of Zaila became one of the earliest Islamic centres in the Horn of Africa. The Masjid al-Qiblatain in Zaila, with its distinctive two-mihrab design, dates to the 7th century and stands as one of the oldest mosques in the world. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Islamic communities were firmly established throughout the region as sophisticated commercial centres controlling trade routes between Africa, Arabia, and the Indian Ocean. The wealth generated by this strategic positioning led to the emergence of the Sultanate of Ifat, founded in 1285 CE by the Walashma dynasty. This represents the moment when scattered Islamic trading communities recognized the need for better political organization, essentially forming a medieval chamber of commerce with considerably more military capability and territorial ambitions. Sultan Umar Walashma conquered the Sultanate of Shoa the same year, demonstrating ambitions beyond simple trade management. Historian Tadesse Tamrat describes this as an effort to consolidate Muslim territories in the Horn of Africa, much as Emperor Yakuno Amlak was attempting to unite Christian territories in the Ethiopian highlands during the same period. It was medieval political consolidation on a grand scale, though with significantly higher stakes than modern corporate mergers. The Ifat Sultanate controlled territory encompassing much of present-day eastern Ethiopia, Djibouti, and northern Somalia, with an impressive army of 20,000 soldiers and 15,000 horsemen, according to historian Al-Umari. These numbers suggest either remarkable military organization or optimistic medieval census-taking, though the Sultanate's documented territorial control indicates substantial military capability. The capital city, described by 13th century geographer Ibn Sa'id al-Maghribi as Wafat, was located in an elevated valley next to a river, where inhabitants cultivated bananas and sugarcane. This suggests that despite the region's current arid climate, the medieval period benefited from significantly more favourable growing conditions. Al-Umari mentioned 7 cities within: Ifat, Bikulzar, Quelgora, Shimi, Shewa, Adal, Jame, and Labu, indicating this was a genuine territorial empire with sophisticated urban centres and administrative infrastructure. The inhabitants of Ifat spoke what Al-Umari described as Abyssinian and Arabic, reflecting the cosmopolitan nature of these trading communities where multiple languages were essential for commercial success. This linguistic diversity extended to the Sultanate's population, which included ethnic groups such as the Argoba, Harari, Afar, and Somali peoples, along with Arab merchants and scholars who had settled in the region over previous centuries. The successful integration of these diverse groups under Islamic governance demonstrated sophisticated political management that balanced religious unity with cultural diversity. However, this expansion brought inevitable conflict with the Christian Ethiopian Empire. The clash reached a climax when Emperor Amda-Seyon I killed Sultan Huk ad-Din I of Ifat in 1332, then appointed Jamal ad-Din as the new sultan. Despite this setback, Islamic resistance continued throughout the 14th century until Sultan Huk ad-Din II transferred Ifat's capital to the Harar Plateau around 1376, a move some historians consider the true founding of the Adal Sultanate. The early 15th century brought decisive change when Emperor Dawit I of Ethiopia assembled a large army and launched what he presumably considered a final solution to the Muslim problem in the region. After considerable fighting, Ifat's forces were defeated, and the Sultanate's ruler, Sa'ad ad-Din II, fled to Zaila. He was pursued by Ethiopian forces and killed there around 1403, though the exact circumstances remain disputed. Some sources claim Zaila was sacked, while others suggest the Ethiopian invasion of the coastal city was less dramatic than portrayed. Sa'ad ad-Din's children and the remainder of the Walashma dynasty fled to Yemen, where they lived in exile until 1415. This exile period proves that even medieval political refugees understood the importance of maintaining hope for eventual return, though it probably helped that Yemen offered a considerably more hospitable environment than the alternatives available to displaced royalty at the time. The return from Yemeni exile marked the beginning of what would become known as the Adal Sultanate, one of the most significant Islamic states in Horn of Africa history. Sabah ad-Din III, the eldest son of Sa'ad ad-Din II, established a new capital at Dakar upon his return in 1415 and proclaimed himself King of Adal, signalling a clear break from Ifat's previous status and the beginning of a new phase of Islamic political organization in the region. The Adal Sultanate represented a remarkable achievement in medieval statecraft. At its height, it controlled large parts of modern-day Somalia, Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Eritrea, making it one of the largest states in the Horn of Africa. Historic cities flourished under Adal rule, with archaeologists discovering sophisticated urban planning including courtyard houses, mosques, shrines, and cisterns. Xyla reached new heights of prosperity, serving as the principal gateway for trade in slaves, ivory, and other commodities with Arabia and beyond. Perhaps the most remarkable leader was Imam Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, known as Gran or Guri, meaning the left-handed. Between 1529 and 1543, Ahmad led the conquest of Abyssinia, or Futu al-Habash, which nearly conquered the entire Ethiopian empire. His forces controlled most of modern Ethiopia, reaching the Red Sea coast and reducing Emperor Lebna Dengel to essentially a fugitive in his own territory. Ahmad's campaign was particularly formidable due to his pioneering use of firearms supplied by the Ottoman Empire, imported through Xyla and deployed against Ethiopian forces still relying on traditional weapons. This represents one of the earliest examples of technological superiority, determining military outcomes in African conflicts. The Adalite armies reportedly achieved remarkable success in converting newly occupied territories, with Muslim chronicles suggesting widespread conversion to Islam, though whether from conviction or expediency remains debated. However, Ahmad's success was ultimately undone by Portuguese intervention. The Portuguese, allies of the Ethiopian Empire, provided military assistance that helped tip the balance. Ahmad was killed in battle in 1543, and without his charismatic leadership, the Adalite conquest unravelled. The collapse opened the door for Oromo migrations, as the Oromo people moved into territories weakened by constant warfare, fundamentally altering the demographic landscape of the Horn of Africa. Following the Oromo invasions, the Adal Sultanate fragmented into several smaller successor states. The Walashma dynasty, which had ruled both Ifat and Adal for centuries, demonstrated remarkable resilience throughout these transformations. According to various sources, the Walashma sultans maintained impressive courts with luxurious robes adorned with silver, daggers decorated with gold and precious stones, and parasols imported from Syria that featured painted winged serpents, items that impressed even critical Christian observers. The Walashma princes claimed Arab genealogical traditions, though modern historians suggest they were more likely local leaders who adopted Islamic identity and Arabian cultural elements to enhance their legitimacy. Their success lay not just in military prowess, but in their ability to synthesize local traditions with Islamic governance, creating political structures that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining cultural continuity. Archaeological excavations throughout the region have revealed the material culture of these medieval Islamic states. Silver coins from Mamluk Egypt have been discovered at sites near Borama, indicating extensive trade networks. The prevalence of these coins suggests that the Adalite economy was integrated into broader Islamic commercial systems, with local rulers sophisticated enough to participate in international monetary networks that stretched from Cairo to the Indian Ocean. For the area that would become modern Djibouti, this fragmentation meant the emergence of localized sultanates controlling different portions of the territory and coast. The Sultanate of Tajura became one of the most significant, emerging as one of four principal Afar sultanates, along with Raheta, Osa, and Gobard, that divided former Adalite territories among themselves. The rulers, known as Dardar, claimed authority over northern Afar tribes and maintained sophisticated systems for managing the harsh Danakil environment while controlling trade routes through challenging terrain. Tajura became particularly important as a port for pilgrims travelling to Mecca and as a centre for the continuing slave trade connecting East Africa with Middle Eastern and Indian Ocean markets. The city's mosques and Islamic educational institutions attracted scholars and students from throughout the Horn of Africa, making it a significant centre of Islamic learning as well as commerce. The town's distinctive architecture from this period, with whitewashed buildings, coral stone construction, and geometric tilework on minarets, reflects the influence of Swahili coastal culture, Arab architectural traditions, and local adaptation to the challenging climate. Similarly, Obok emerged as another significant centre, providing access to interior trade routes while maintaining Red Sea connections. Both cities operated within the broader context of Ottoman influence from the 16th through 18th centuries, though Ottoman authority was often more theoretical than practical. The Ottomans were primarily interested in maintaining friendly relations with local rulers who could facilitate trade and ensure merchant safety, an arrangement that suited local sultanates perfectly, providing diplomatic protection and commercial opportunities without requiring surrender of significant autonomy. During the late Ottoman period, Egyptian forces under Muhammad Ali Pasha briefly occupied various coastal positions between 1821 and 1841. However, Egyptian control proved superficial, as they lacked resources for effective administration of such remote territories. Their withdrawal in the 1860s created a power vacuum that coincided with increasing European interest following the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. As we conclude this exploration of Djibouti's medieval period, it's worth noting the remarkable continuity of strategic importance throughout centuries of change. Whether under Ifat, Adal, or local sultanates, the region continued serving as a crucial link between Africa, Arabia, and the Indian Ocean trading networks. The conversion to Islam didn't eliminate local traditions, but rather created a unique synthesis that combined Islamic governance with indigenous social structures, Afar and Somali cultural practices, and Arabian commercial networks. The architectural legacy of this period remains visible today in the whitewashed mosques, coral stone construction, and geometric decorative elements found in Tajura and Obok. These buildings represent not just Islamic influence but a sophisticated adaptation to local climate and materials, creating a distinctive regional style that balanced religious requirements with practical considerations of desert architecture. The economic networks established during the medieval period created trading relationships that extended from the Ethiopian highlands to the Arabian Peninsula, the Red Sea ports, and beyond to India and Southeast Asia. Local merchants became skilled not just in commerce but in the complex cultural negotiations required for successful long-distance trade, developing linguistic abilities and cultural knowledge that made them invaluable intermediaries in an increasingly connected medieval world. The social structures that emerged during this period also proved remarkably durable. The clan-based organization of Afar and Somali society is adapted to Islamic frameworks while maintaining traditional patterns of nomadic movement, resource sharing, and conflict resolution. This flexibility would prove crucial during the challenging centuries that followed, as local communities navigated the decline of great sultanates, the rise of new powers, and eventually the arrival of European colonialism. By 1862, when French representatives began negotiating treaties with local sultans, they encountered political structures representing centuries of adaptation to controlling strategic territory in one of the world's most important maritime regions. The sophistication of these arrangements, combining Islamic legitimacy with traditional authority and commercial expertise, would significantly influence how European colonization developed during the era that was about to begin. Chapter 3. The French have arrived, and they're staying. The year 1862 marked the beginning of what would become one of the longest-running real estate transactions in modern history. While most people purchase property with mortgages, the French government decided to acquire strategic coastal territory through a combination of diplomatic negotiation, convenient timing, and the sort of persistent colonial enthusiasm that characterized 19th century European expansion. The result was the establishment of what would eventually become the last French colony in Africa to gain independence. The story begins with Henri Lambert, the French consul in Ardennes, who in 1855 visited Tadjoura and established what can only be described as a mutually beneficial friendship with Abubakar Ibrahim Chehem, the Pasha of Zaila. Lambert had helped secure Abubakar's release from prison after the latter was charged with embezzlement by a political rival, creating the sort of diplomatic debt that tends to generate lasting gratitude, or at least a willingness to discuss territorial cessions. In exchange for this assistance, Abu Bakr offered to cede the coastal strip around Obok to the French. This represents an early example of what modern diplomats might call personal relationship-based international agreements, though Lambert's assassination in 1859, almost certainly plotted by Abu Bakr's rival, put the French acquisition temporarily on hold. Nothing disrupts international negotiations quite like the untimely death of the chief negotiator. However, by 1862, French determination had overcome this minor diplomatic setback. Through treaties signed with the sultans of Raheta, Tadjoura, and Gobad, France acquired territorial rights for all of the modern-day Djibouti coast, stretching from southwest of Obok to the present-day northern coastal border with Eritrea. The French paid 10,000 thalers, approximately 55,000 gold francs, for this purchase, which in retrospect represents one of the better real estate investments in modern African history. The initial French presence was decidedly minimal. For nearly 20 years, French authority in the region was represented primarily by a tricolour flag guarded by an elderly Danakil man who received occasional visits from French naval vessels. This arrangement suggests either remarkable confidence in the power of symbolic authority or an admirably relaxed approach to colonial administration. The flagkeeper essentially functioned as history's most isolated civil servant, maintaining French territorial claims through sheer persistence. French interest in the region intensified significantly during the 1880s, driven by broader strategic considerations related to the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 and increasing British activity in Egypt. The establishment of the Suez Canal had transformed the Red Sea from a regional trade route into one of the world's most important maritime highways, making control of Red Sea ports suddenly much more valuable than anyone had anticipated. Between 1883 and 1887, France expanded its influence through various treaties with local Somali and Afar sultans, effectively transforming scattered coastal holdings into a proper protectorate. The arrival of Léonce Lagarde in 1884 marked the beginning of serious French colonial administration, with Obok serving as the initial capital of what was grandly titled the Territory of Obok and Dependencies. However, Obok proved to have significant limitations as a colonial headquarters. While it possessed a natural harbour, the location was too far from interior trade routes, lacked adequate fresh water supplies, and offered limited room for expansion. By 1888, French officials had identified a superior location across the Gulf of Tadjoura that would become the foundation of modern Djibouti city. The new port city was strategically positioned with access to better water supplies, a superior natural harbour, and proximity to caravan routes connecting the coast with the Ethiopian highlands. Construction began immediately, and by 1894 the colonial administration had officially relocated from Obok to Djibouti, which became the capital of the newly reconstituted French Somaliland colony. The speed of this development reflected both French organizational efficiency and the immediate recognition that they had found an ideal location for their East African operations. The transformation from minor coaling station to significant colonial port was accelerated by one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects of the era, the construction of a railway connecting Djibouti to Addis Ababa. This railway project, initiated by the Imperial Railway Company of Ethiopia in 1897, represented exactly the sort of grand engineering undertaking that appealed to both French colonial ambitions and Ethiopian modernization efforts. The railway construction faced the considerable challenge of traversing some of the most difficult terrain on Earth, including sections of the Great Rift Valley, desert plateaus, and mountain ranges that seemed designed to discourage railroad construction. The project required negotiating everything from extreme temperature variations to seasonal flooding, not to mention complex diplomatic arrangements between French colonial authorities and Ethiopian imperial administration. Despite these challenges, construction proceeded steadily. The line reached Diadawa by 1902, providing access to the important trading centre of Harar. Construction continued through the Ethiopian highlands, with the railway finally reaching Addis Ababa in June 1917. The completed line stretched 784 kilometres, of which approximately 100 kilometres lay within Djibouti, creating the most important transportation link between landlocked Ethiopia and the sea. The railway's completion transformed Djibouti from a modest colonial outpost into a bustling international port. Ethiopian coffee, hides, and other exports flowed through Djibouti to markets throughout Europe, Asia, and the Americas. The city's population grew rapidly, reaching 15,000 residents during the railway construction boom, making it larger than any Ethiopian city except Harar at the time. The economic impact extended far beyond simple population growth. Djibouti became a crucial link in global trade networks, handling goods flowing between 3 continents. The port developed sophisticated infrastructure for storing and shipping Ethiopian exports, while simultaneously serving as the entry point for manufactured goods, machinery, and other imports destined for Ethiopia's growing economy. The combination of strategic location and railroad access created exactly the sort of commercial hub that colonial administrators had envisioned when they first negotiated for coastal territory. However, the establishment of French colonial authority was not simply a matter of building ports and railways. The colonial administration had to navigate complex relationships with local political structures that had governed the region for centuries. The various Afar and Somali sultans who controlled different territories were sophisticated political leaders with their own interests, alliances, and territorial claims that couldn't simply be ignored or overruled. French colonial policy in the region demonstrated considerable pragmatism in dealing with these local authorities. Rather than attempting to completely replace existing political structures, French administrators generally worked through established leaders, providing them with protection and administrative support in exchange for acknowledgement of French authority and cooperation with colonial policies. This approach avoided much of the resistance that characterized French colonial expansion in other regions, while maintaining stability necessary for commercial development. The colonial administration established clear boundaries for French Somaliland through agreements with neighbouring powers. The border with Ethiopia was demarcated in 1897 and reaffirmed in agreements with Emperor Menelik II and later with Emperor Haile Selassie in 1945 and 1954. These border agreements provided the legal framework that would eventually define the boundaries of independent Djibouti. French Somaliland's strategic importance was demonstrated during the First World War, when the colony served as a crucial supply route for Allied operations. The railway to Ethiopia proved invaluable for maintaining regional communication and supply lines, while port facilities handled increased military and commercial traffic. The interwar period saw continued infrastructure development and expansion of the colony's role in regional trade. Port facilities were modernized for larger vessels, while railway improvements increased capacity and reliability. French Somaliland became integral to the colonial empire's Indian Ocean operations, serving as a crucial link between territories in Madagascar and Indochina. However, the most significant test of French colonial authority came during the Second World War, when the global conflict created unprecedented challenges for colonial administrations throughout the French Empire. The fall of France in June 1940 placed French Somaliland in an extraordinarily difficult position, caught between competing claims from Vichy France, the Free French movement, and Allied strategic interests. Initially, the colonial administration declared loyalty to Marshal Pétain's Vichy regime, a decision that reflected both legal considerations about governmental authority and practical concerns about managing a distant colony during wartime. Governor Hubert Jules Deschamps and military commander General Paul Le Gentilhomme found themselves navigating increasingly complex political and diplomatic pressures as the war developed. The situation became even more complicated when Italy entered the war in June 1940 and began threatening French Somaliland from their positions in neighbouring Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. Italian forces quickly surrounded the colony on land, while maintaining pressure through diplomatic channels and occasional military probes along the borders. The colony found itself isolated, dependent on supply lines that became increasingly difficult to maintain. Internal political tensions reached a crisis point when the local administrative council voted to remain loyal to Vichy, leading to the resignation of General Le Gentilhomme, who opposed collaboration with the German Allied regime. He was replaced by General Germain, who accepted Vichy authority and attempted to maintain the colony's neutrality while dealing with increasing pressure from both Italian forces and British naval operations in the Red Sea. The Royal Navy established a blockade of French Somaliland in September 1940, effectively isolating the colony from outside supplies while attempting to pressure the administration to join the Free French cause. This blockade created severe shortages of food and other essential supplies, leading to widespread malnutrition and disease that disproportionately affected women and children throughout the colony. Governor Pierre Noël-Hétas, who replaced Germain, instituted increasingly harsh measures to maintain order and suppress any pro-Allied activities. Europeans suspected of contact with the Allies were interned at Obok, while dozens of others were condemned to death or forced labour, mostly in absentia. 6 Africans were shot without trial in May 1941 as an example to potential deserters, while brutal conditions in internment camps claimed many additional lives. The situation for French Somaliland began to change as the broader war turned against the Axis powers. The successful British campaign against Italian forces in East Africa eliminated the immediate military threat to the colony, while growing evidence of Allied strength encouraged increasing resistance to Vichy authority. By late 1942, the brutal governance of Noël-Hétas had become too extreme even for Vichy standards, leading to his recall and forced retirement. The liberation of French Somaliland came in December 1942, following complex negotiations between British, Free French, and American representatives. The colony's strategic importance made its liberation a priority for Allied operations in the region, while its port and railway facilities were needed for supporting operations throughout East Africa and the Middle East. Free French and Allied forces entered Djibouti without significant resistance, ending more than 2 years of Vichy rule and Allied blockade. The liberation was celebrated throughout the colony, though the years of isolation and hardship had taken a severe toll on the population. Recovery required extensive reconstruction of infrastructure, restoration of trade relationships, and rebuilding of social services that had deteriorated during the war years. A local battalion from French Somaliland participated in the liberation of France in 1944, representing the colony's contribution to the broader Allied victory in Europe. This participation demonstrated that even the smallest French territories played important roles in the global conflict and the eventual restoration of French independence. The immediate post-war period marked a new chapter in French colonial administration. In 1946, French Somaliland was redesignated as an overseas territory within the French Union, providing it with representation in the French National Assembly and greater autonomy in local affairs. This change reflected broader reforms in French colonial policy that recognized the need for greater political participation by colonial populations. The establishment of the French Union created new opportunities for political development within the colony. Local political parties emerged, representing different ethnic groups and ideological perspectives, while elections for territorial assembly provided experience in democratic governance. These developments set the foundation for the political evolution that would eventually lead to independence 3 decades later. By 1946, French Somaliland had been transformed from a minor coaling station into a crucial strategic asset that demonstrated the remarkable development potential of well-positioned colonial territories. The combination of natural harbour facilities, railway connections to the interior, and sophisticated administrative infrastructure had created exactly the sort of modern port city that colonial planners had envisioned when they first negotiated for territory along the Red Sea coast. As we conclude this exploration of French colonial establishment in Djibouti, it's worth reflecting on the remarkable transformation over 8 decades of administration. The territory evolved from scattered coastal holdings to a unified colony with modern infrastructure, sophisticated political institutions, and crucial importance to regional trade and global military strategy. The foundation laid during this period proved essential for the challenges and opportunities ahead during the final decades of colonial rule and eventual independence. Chapter 4: Independence Dreams and Cold War Schemes. The period between 1946 and 1977 represents one of the most politically intricate chapters in Djibouti's history, during which a tiny territory at the mouth of the Red Sea found itself at the centre of competing independence movements, Cold War strategizing, and some of the most creatively manipulated referendums in the annals of decolonization. It's a story that demonstrates how even the smallest territories can become major headaches for colonial administrators when local populations develop inconvenient opinions about self-governance. The transformation began in 1946, when French Somaliland was redesignated as an overseas territory within the French Union, providing it with representation in the French National Assembly and considerably more autonomy in local affairs. This change reflected broader reforms in French colonial policy that recognized the growing demand for political participation by colonial populations, though the French government remained hopeful that increased representation would satisfy independence aspirations rather than encouraging them. The new political structure created opportunities for local political parties representing different ethnic groups and ideological perspectives. Elections for the Territorial Assembly provided valuable experience in democratic governance, while representation in the French Parliament gave local leaders direct involvement in the political processes that governed their territory. These developments laid the foundation for the sophisticated political maneuvering that would characterize the independence movement over the following 3 decades. However, the political landscape was complicated by ethnic composition and different political aspirations. The Somali population, primarily the Isa clan, generally favoured independence with eventual unification with Somalia. The Afar community preferred continued French association, viewing French protection as preferable to potential domination by Somali or Ethiopian neighbours. This division would prove crucial in determining independence outcomes, as French administrators became skilled at exploiting these differences to maintain preferred referendum results. The first major test of public opinion came in 1958, when a constitutional referendum was held to determine whether French Somaliland would join the French community as an overseas territory or opt for immediate independence. This referendum took place against the backdrop of neighbouring Somalia's impending independence in 1960, creating significant pressure for Somali populations in French Somaliland to seek unification with their ethnic kinsmen. The campaign leading up to the 1958 referendum featured Hassan Gould Abdidon, a Somali politician who would later become Djibouti's first president, advocating for continued association with France. Gould's position reflected the complex political calculations required in a territory where ethnic allegiances, economic considerations, and strategic assessments all influence political choices. His campaign emphasized the economic benefits of French association and the stability that continued French protection could provide. The referendum results showed 60% support for remaining within the French community, a margin that reflected both genuine political preferences and the effectiveness of French efforts to influence the outcome. The campaign had been marked by significant administrative advantages for the pro-French position, while independence advocates faced restrictions on their ability to organize and campaign effectively. The death of Mahmoud Harbi, vice president of the Government Council and a prominent advocate for independence and eventual unification with Somalia, in a suspicious plane crash in 1960, removed one of the most charismatic leaders of the independence movement. The circumstances surrounding Harbi's death, returning from a trip to China where he had been seeking support for independence, fueled speculation about the lengths to which various interests would go to influence the territory's political development. Throughout the early 1960s, the Cold War context increasingly influenced political developments in French Somaliland. The territory's strategic location made it valuable to both Western and Eastern Bloc powers, while regional conflicts in Ethiopia and Somalia created additional pressures and opportunities for political maneuvering. French policymakers understood that maintaining control of this strategic territory required careful balancing of local political forces with broader international considerations. In August 1966, French President Charles de Gaulle made an official visit to French Somaliland that was met with widespread demonstrations and rioting by Somali populations demanding independence. The intensity of these protests surprised French authorities and demonstrated that the desire for independence had grown significantly since the 1958 referendum. The images of elderly French war veterans being confronted by young African protesters provided exactly the sort of international publicity that independence movements needed and colonial authorities wanted to avoid. In response to the demonstrations, de Gaulle ordered a second referendum to be held in March 1967. However, French authorities were determined to ensure a more favourable outcome this time, implementing what can only be described as creative approaches to electoral administration. Approximately 10,000 Somalis were deported under the pretext that they lacked valid identity cards, while French officials erected a barricade around Djibouti city to prevent outsiders from influencing the referendum. The voter registration process demonstrated remarkable disparities between ethnic groups. According to official figures, although the territory was inhabited by 58,240 Somali and 48,270 Afar, only 14,689 Somali were allowed to register to vote compared to 22,004 Afar. This mathematical creativity would have impressed even the most optimistic campaign managers. Despite these administrative challenges, the 1967 referendum results showed 61% support for continued association with France, though voting was clearly divided along ethnic lines. Somali voters generally supported independence, while Afar voters largely favoured remaining with France. Widespread riots erupted immediately after the announcement of results, particularly in the shantytown district of Djibouti city, where Somali residents expressed their dissatisfaction with both the process and the outcome. Following the referendum, French Somaliland was renamed the French territory of the Afars and the Isas, a change that recognized the ethnic composition of the territory while avoiding any suggestion that it belonged primarily to one group or another. The name change also reflected French hopes that emphasizing ethnic balance rather than territorial unity might reduce independence pressures by highlighting potential conflicts between different communities. The governmental structure was also reorganized, with the position of Governor-General changed to High Commissioner and the establishment of a 9-member Council of Government. These changes provided greater local autonomy while maintaining ultimate French authority over defense, foreign policy, and major economic decisions. The reforms represented a classic colonial strategy of providing enough self-governance to satisfy moderate demands while retaining control over matters that French authorities considered essential. However, demographic trends were working against French hopes for long-term control. The Somali population was growing more rapidly than the Afar population, creating the likelihood that future referendums would produce different results, even if French authorities maintained the same electoral procedures. Additionally, the international climate was becoming increasingly hostile to colonial control, with the United Nations and the Organization of African Unity maintaining pressure for decolonization throughout Africa. The independence movement during this period was led primarily by the Front for the Liberation of the Somali Coast, FLCS, which had been established in the early 1960s with the initial goal of unifying the territory with Somalia as part of a greater Somalia. The FLCS conducted a sustained campaign of political organizing and occasional armed resistance, supported by the Somali government under Siad Barre, which provided arms, training, and safe havens for independence fighters. International support for the independence movement came from various sources, including the Organization of African Unity, which recognized the FLCS as a legitimate liberation movement and provided financial assistance. Some Arab states, particularly Algeria, offered political and material support as part of broader anti-colonial solidarity movements. However, the FLCS faced the challenge of operating in a territory where a significant portion of the population favored continued French rule. By the mid-1970s, several factors converged to make Djibouti independence inevitable. The prohibitive cost of maintaining the colony, France's last outpost on the African continent, became increasingly difficult to justify to French taxpayers. International pressure from the United Nations, the Organization of African Unity, and various Arab states created diplomatic complications for French policy throughout Africa and the Middle East. Perhaps most importantly, the FLCS leadership made a crucial strategic shift away from Somali irredentism towards support for Djibouti independence as a separate state. This change helped build broader coalitions with Afar leaders and other groups, culminating in the creation of the African People's League for Independence, LPAI, in February 1975. The LPAI represented a merger of various independence groups under the leadership of Hassan Gould Abtidon, who had evolved from an advocate of French association to a champion of independence. The formation of the LPAI was crucial because it provided a framework for independence that didn't threaten Afar interests with Somali domination. By emphasizing Djibouti nationalism rather than Somali nationalism, the independence movement could appeal to both major ethnic groups while addressing French concerns about regional stability. This political sophistication demonstrated that the independence movement had learned valuable lessons from the failures of previous campaigns. In 1975, the French government began accommodating increasingly insistent demands for independence through a series of gradual reforms. The territory's citizenship law, which had favoured the Afar minority, was revised in June 1976 to reflect more closely the demographic weight of the Isa Somali population. This change effectively expanded the electorate in ways that made independence more likely to succeed in any future referendum. The third and final referendum was held on May 8, 1977, alongside elections for a constituent assembly that would draft the constitution for an independent Djibouti. This time, French authorities made no serious effort to manipulate the outcome, having concluded that independence was inevitable and that maintaining good relations with the future government was more important than preventing independence itself. The results were decisive. 98.8% of the electorate supported disengagement from France, officially marking Djibouti's path to independence. The overwhelming majority reflected both genuine support for independence and the absence of the electoral manipulation that had characterized previous referendums. The margin was so large that even French officials acknowledged the clear expression of popular will. On June 27, 1977, Djibouti became independent as the Republic of Djibouti, with Hassan Guled Abdidan as its first president. The independence ceremony marked the end of 115 years of French rule and the establishment of Africa's last colony to achieve independence. The new state immediately joined the United Nations, the Organization of African Unity, and the Arab League, demonstrating its intention to maintain balanced international relations. Gould's emergence as the first president represented a remarkable political transformation for someone who had advocated for continued French association in 1958. His evolution reflected the broader political sophistication that had developed within the independence movement, as leaders learned to adapt their strategies to changing circumstances and opportunities. His famous declaration that independence should be achieved with France, not against it, helped ensure a smooth transition that maintained beneficial relationships with the former colonial power. The new government faced the immediate challenge of managing ethnic tensions between Somali and Afar communities, while establishing effective institutions for governing a diverse population. Gould's approach emphasized ethnic balance in government appointments, bringing Afar leaders into his cabinet while maintaining Isa dominance in key positions. This careful political balancing would prove essential for maintaining stability during the crucial early years of independence. Djibouti's independence occurred at the height of the Cold War, when the strategic importance of the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden made the new nation immediately valuable to both Western and Soviet interests. The establishment of independence with strong French connections ensured that Djibouti would align with Western powers, though the government maintained careful neutrality in regional conflicts to avoid being drawn into larger proxy wars. The transition to independence was facilitated by agreements that allowed France to maintain military bases and significant economic influence in exchange for security guarantees and continued economic assistance. This arrangement provided Djibouti with protection against potential threats from larger neighbours, while ensuring French access to strategic facilities. The compromise satisfied both French strategic interests and Djibouti's need for external support during the vulnerable early years of independence. As we conclude this examination of Djibouti's path to independence, it's worth reflecting on the remarkable political journey that transformed a divided colonial territory into a unified independent state. The process required extraordinary skill from leaders who overcame ethnic divisions, French manipulation, and regional pressures to achieve independence. The foundation established during this period, balancing ethnic interests, maintaining international relationships, and leveraging strategic location, would prove crucial for navigating post-independence challenges in one of the world's most difficult neighborhoods. Chapter 5: A New Nation Finds Its Feet. The early years of Djibouti's independence represent a masterclass in political balancing, strategic positioning, and the remarkable challenge of building a functioning nation from a collection of ethnic groups, colonial administrative structures, and economic dependencies. Like a tightrope walker performing over a pit of regional conflicts, Hassan Gould Abtaiden's government had to maintain stability while navigating between competing ethnic interests, Cold War pressures, and the fundamental challenge of creating a viable economy in one of the world's harshest environments. When Djibouti achieved independence on June 27, 1977, the new nation inherited both tremendous strategic advantages and equally significant structural challenges. The country possessed arguably the most valuable piece of real estate in the Horn of Africa, a deep water port controlling access between the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. But its population of fewer than 300,000 people was divided between competing ethnic groups with different political visions for their shared future. Hassan Gould Abtaiden's immediate priority was establishing governmental institutions that could function effectively while maintaining the delicate ethnic balance that had made independence possible. His approach involved creating what political scientists might call consociational democracy, a system designed to ensure that different ethnic groups had guaranteed representation in government structures. This meant appointing afar politicians to key positions, including the prime ministership, while maintaining Isa dominance in the presidency and most cabinet positions. The new government's first major political challenge came just months after independence with what became known as the Zinc Palm attack in December 1977. This incident, involving an assault on a popular nightclub frequented by French expatriates and government officials, provided the government with justification for banning the main opposition party, the Mouvement Populaire de Libération, MPL, and beginning the transition towards single-party rule that would characterize Djibouti politics for the next 15 years. The response to the Zinc Palm attack demonstrated Hassan Gould's pragmatic approach to governance, which prioritized stability over democratic ideals when the two came into conflict. His reasoning, shared by many African leaders of this generation, was that multi-party competition in ethnically divided societies often exacerbated tensions rather than resolving them through democratic processes. Whether this reasoning was correct remains a matter of considerable debate among political scientists, but it certainly shaped Djibouti's political development for decades. In 1979, Hassan Gould formalized single-party rule by establishing the Rassemblement Populaire pour le Progrès as the only legal political party. The RPP was designed to be an umbrella organization that could accommodate different ethnic groups and political perspectives within a single institutional framework, though in practice it remained dominated by Hassan Gould's Mamasan subclan of the Issa community. This arrangement provided stability at the cost of political competition, creating a system that opponents would later characterize as ethnic dictatorship. The economic foundation of the new state rested almost entirely on port services, government employment, and French subsidies that covered approximately 70% of the national budget during the early independence years. This economic structure reflected both Djibouti's strategic location and its lack of other natural resources, creating a situation where the government essentially served as the middleman for Ethiopian trade while providing employment for a significant portion of the educated population. The Franco-Ethiopian Railway, completed in 1917, provided the physical infrastructure that connected landlocked Ethiopia to Djibouti's port facilities. This railway carried approximately 80% of Ethiopia's imports and exports during the early independence period, generating transit taxes and harbour fees that formed the bulk of government revenue. The relationship with Ethiopia thus became fundamental to Djibouti's economic survival, creating interdependencies that would only grow stronger over subsequent decades. However, Djibouti's economic model during the 1980s proved increasingly fragile as international economic conditions changed and regional conflicts disrupted trade patterns. The government's emphasis on state-controlled enterprises and heavy dependence on French subsidies created inefficiencies that limited private sector development and economic diversification. Gross domestic product per capita remained stagnant around $800 to $1,000 throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, reflecting chronic fiscal deficits and limited productive economic growth. The global economic recession of the late 1980s particularly affected Djibouti's port-dependent economy, as reduced international trade meant fewer ships requiring Djibouti's services. Poor economic planning and reduced foreign assistance led to GDP growth that averaged only 1% per year from 1989 to 1991, creating increasing pressure on the government's ability to provide employment and services for its growing population. These economic pressures coincided with growing political tensions between ethnic communities, particularly as the Afar population began demanding greater representation in government and military positions. Despite Hassan Gould's efforts to maintain ethnic balance through cabinet appointments and symbolic gestures, real power remained concentrated among Issa politicians, creating resentment among Afar communities that would eventually explode into open conflict. The situation was further complicated by regional conflicts that affected Djibouti's strategic environment. The Ogaden War between Ethiopia and Somalia in 1977 and 1978 forced Djibouti to maintain careful neutrality despite ethnic ties between its Somali population and the combatants. The government's pronounced tilt towards supporting Somalia during this conflict created tensions with Ethiopia and demonstrated the difficulty of maintaining neutrality when ethnic loyalties crossed international borders. The 1980s also witnessed the beginning of the refugee crisis that would profoundly impact Djibouti's demographics and economy. Conflicts in Somalia, Ethiopia, and later Eritrea created waves of refugees seeking safety in Djibouti's relatively stable environment. While international organizations provided some assistance for refugee programs, the influx of displaced populations created additional pressure on already limited resources and infrastructure. By the late 1980s, opposition to Hassan Gould's rule was growing among Afar communities who felt marginalized by single-party politics dominated by Issa politicians. The formation of various Afar political organizations, initially operating clandestinely, reflected deeper grievances about political representation, economic opportunities, and cultural recognition within the Djiboutian state structure. The end of the Cold War in 1989 created additional pressures for political liberalization throughout Africa, as international donors increasingly linked economic assistance to democratic reforms. France, Djibouti's primary patron, began encouraging political opening while maintaining its strategic military presence. This international pressure coincided with domestic demands for greater political participation, creating a context where continued single-party rule became increasingly difficult to sustain. In November 1991, these accumulated pressures exploded into open civil war when the Front for the Restoration of Unity and Democracy, FRUD, launched an armed insurgency against the government. FRUD represented primarily Afar communities and was formed through the merger of three militant groups that had been organizing in opposition to what they characterized as Issa domination of the political system. The FRUD insurgency was led by experienced military officers, including Ahmed Dini Ahmed, who had served in the French colonial army and later held senior positions in the Djiboutian government before joining the opposition. The rebels controlled significant territory in the northern and western regions where Afar populations were concentrated, creating a genuine threat to the government's authority and territorial integrity. The civil war represented far more than an ethnic conflict. It reflected fundamental disagreements about the nature of the Djiboutian state and the distribution of political and economic power within society. FRUD demands included democratization, power-sharing arrangements that would guarantee Afar representation, and economic development programs for regions that had been neglected since independence. The government's response to the Flood insurgency demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of Hassan Gould's political approach. On the military side, government forces were able to contain the rebellion and prevent it from threatening the capital or major economic infrastructure. However, the conflict revealed the fundamental weakness of a political system that had failed to create institutional mechanisms for resolving ethnic grievances through peaceful means. International pressure, particularly from France, played a crucial role in encouraging both sides to seek a negotiated settlement rather than pursuing military victory. The French government, with significant economic and military interests in Djibouti, understood that prolonged civil war would undermine the stability that made Djibouti valuable as a strategic partner. French diplomatic efforts, combined with regional mediation, helped create the framework for peace negotiations. The civil war also highlighted the limits of single-party rule in managing ethnic diversity, forcing Hassan Gould to consider political reforms that he had previously resisted. In early 1992, the government adopted a new constitution that authorized multi-party politics, though with significant restrictions that limited the number of legal political parties to 4. This reform represented a calculated compromise designed to address flood demands while maintaining government control over the political process. The 1992 parliamentary elections were held under these new multi-party arrangements, though Flood was excluded from participation due to its continued armed resistance. The elections were widely criticized by international observers as fraudulent, with the RPP claiming victory through what appeared to be systematic manipulation of the electoral process. These elections demonstrated that political liberalization would be a gradual and contested process, rather than a simple transition to democratic governance. Economic conditions during the Civil War period deteriorated significantly, with GDP growth becoming negative as resources were diverted from development projects to military expenditures. The informal economy flourished as formal economic structures were disrupted, leading to what the United Nations Development Programme reported as a 5.5% annual decrease in recorded GDP from 1991 to 1994. The peace process gained momentum in 1993 and 1994 as both sides recognized the costs of continued conflict. The government faced increasing international pressure to reach a settlement, while Flood leadership acknowledged that military victory was unlikely and that negotiated power sharing might achieve their core objectives more effectively than continued warfare. On December 26, 1994, the government and the main Flood faction signed a comprehensive peace accord that ended 3 years of civil war. The agreement included provisions for Flood's transformation from armed movement to legal political party, integration of Flood fighters into government security forces, and guaranteed Afar representation in government positions. 2 prominent Flood leaders were immediately appointed to cabinet positions, demonstrating the government's commitment to implementation. However, the peace process was complicated by divisions within Flood itself, as some factions rejected the agreement and continued armed resistance under the leadership of Ahmed Dini Ahmed. This split within the opposition movement reflected different strategic assessments about whether negotiation or continued armed struggle was more likely to achieve Afar political objectives. The post-Civil War period witnessed significant changes in Djibouti's political landscape as the government implemented democratic reforms while maintaining ultimate control over key institutions. The 1997 legislative elections were more credible than the 1992 polls, though they still resulted in the RPP winning all 65 National Assembly seats in coalition with the legalized arm of Flood. Opposition parties boycotted these elections, arguing that the playing field remained tilted in favor of the ruling party. Hassan Gould's decision to step down in 1999 after 22 years in power represented a remarkable achievement for African governance, as peaceful transfers of power remained rare on the continent. His choice of successor, his nephew Ismail Omar Guelleh, who had served as his chief of staff and head of national security, ensured continuity in policies while potentially bringing fresh perspectives to governance challenges. The 1999 presidential election marked Djibouti's first genuinely competitive presidential contest since independence, with international observers declaring the polls generally free and fair despite advantages enjoyed by the ruling party candidate. Guelleh's victory with 74% of the vote against opposition candidate Musa Ahmed Idris demonstrated both the effectiveness of the RPP political machine and the beginning of a new generation of leadership. Economic recovery during the late 1990s benefited significantly from regional developments that increased Djibouti's strategic value. The border war between Ethiopia and Eritrea from 1998 to 2000 forced Ethiopia to redirect virtually all of its trade through Djibouti's port facilities, creating an economic windfall that helped compensate for the losses suffered during the civil war period. This increased Ethiopian dependence on Djibouti's port created opportunities for infrastructure development and economic diversification, as both countries recognized the benefits of improving trade facilitation. However, it also created new dependencies that would make Djibouti's economy increasingly vulnerable to political and economic developments in Ethiopia. As the 20th century concluded, Djibouti had successfully navigated the transition from colonial territory to independent state, survived a major civil war, and established the foundation for political stability based on ethnic power-sharing arrangements. The challenges of the independence period, building effective institutions, managing ethnic diversity, and creating economic opportunities in a harsh environment, had been addressed through pragmatic compromises rather than idealistic solutions. The legacy of Hassan Gould's presidency was decidedly mixed. He had maintained stability and territorial integrity while building a political system that privileged stability over democracy and economic dependence over diversification. Whether this approach represented wise pragmatism or missed opportunities for more inclusive development would become a subject of ongoing debate, as Djibouti entered the 21st century under new leadership facing new challenges and opportunities. Chapter 6: Modern Djibouti, Strategic Crossroads. The 21st century has transformed Djibouti from a modest port state dependent on French subsidies and Ethiopian trade into one of the world's most strategically valuable pieces of real estate, hosting more foreign military bases per square kilometre than any other country on Earth. Under Ismail Omar Guelleh's presidency, which began in 1999 and continues into 2025, this tiny nation has become a masterclass in small state diplomacy, leveraging its geographic position to attract global superpowers while navigating the complex challenges of debt, development, and democracy in an increasingly multipolar world. When President Guelleh took office, Djibouti faced the familiar challenges that had defined its independence era: economic dependence on port services, ethnic tensions requiring careful management, and the ongoing need to balance relationships with multiple international patrons. However, the new millennium brought unprecedented opportunities as global events reshaped the strategic landscape of the Horn of Africa and the broader Middle East. The September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks fundamentally altered Djibouti's strategic value, transforming what had been primarily a commercial port into a critical node in the global war on terror. The United States, previously content with modest diplomatic engagement, suddenly recognized Djibouti's potential as a staging ground for military operations across the Middle East and Africa. This recognition led to the establishment of Camp Lemonnier in 2002, America's only permanent military base on the African continent. Camp Lemonnier, initially leasing approximately 500 acres near Djibouti's international airport, would expand dramatically over subsequent years to accommodate thousands of American military personnel and contractors. The base serves multiple functions: counter-terrorism operations throughout the Horn of Africa, support for anti-piracy missions in the Gulf of Aden, humanitarian assistance coordination, and intelligence gathering across a region that includes Somalia, Yemen, and the broader Arabian Peninsula. The American military presence brought immediate economic benefits, with the United States paying approximately $63 million annually in base rental fees while employing hundreds of local workers and purchasing significant quantities of goods and services. More importantly, the American commitment provided security guarantees that enabled Djibouti to pursue ambitious development projects without fear of regional interference. However, President Gwele's strategic vision extended far beyond dependency on a single international partner, no matter how powerful. His administration pursued what diplomats call multi-vector foreign policy, actively courting military and economic relationships with multiple global powers simultaneously. This approach reflected both pragmatic recognition of Djibouti's vulnerability and sophisticated understanding of how small states can maximize their bargaining power in great power competition. France maintained its historical presence through approximately 1,500 troops stationed at multiple facilities, continuing the relationship that dated to colonial times, while adapting to changing strategic circumstances. Japan, driven by concerns about piracy affecting its commercial shipping, established a self-defense force base near Djibouti City in 2011, marking Japan's first overseas military facility since World War II. Italy followed with its own military installation, recognizing Djibouti's value for Mediterranean security and migration management. The most significant addition to Djibouti's collection of foreign military bases came in 2017, when China opened its first overseas military installation, euphemistically called a logistics support facility, but unmistakably resembling the military bases operated by other powers. China's entry into Djibouti represented a remarkable shift in global strategic competition, bringing the world's rising superpower into direct proximity with American forces in a region of critical importance to both nations. China's relationship with Djibouti extends far beyond military considerations, encompassing massive infrastructure investments that have fundamentally transformed the country's economic landscape. As part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese companies have financed and constructed projects worth billions of dollars, including new ports, railways, airports, water pipelines, and industrial zones. These investments represent a scale of development assistance unprecedented in Djibouti's history. The crown jewel of Chinese investment is the Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway, completed in 2017 at a cost of approximately $4 billion. This 755-kilometre electric railway connects Ethiopia's capital with Djibouti's port facilities, reducing transport time from 3 days by road to 12 hours by rail. The project represents the largest infrastructure development in the Horn of Africa since the original Franco-Ethiopian Railway was completed a century earlier. Chinese investments also include the $3.5 billion Djibouti International Free Trade Zone, designed to become Africa's largest free trade area, and massive port expansion projects that have quadrupled Djibouti's container handling capacity since 2010. The Doraleh Container Terminal, developed in partnership with Dubai Ports World before becoming a source of international controversy, handles the majority of Ethiopia's trade and generates substantial revenue for the Djiboutian government. However, this rapid development has come at a considerable cost, with Djibouti's external debt rising from 34% of GDP in 2013 to over 100% by 2018. The majority of this debt is owed to Chinese financial institutions, particularly the Export-Import Bank of China, leading to concerns about debt, sustainability, and potential loss of sovereignty over critical infrastructure. These concerns materialized dramatically in 2018 when Djibouti terminated Dubai Ports World's contract to operate the Doraleh container terminal, effectively nationalizing the facility amid accusations that Chinese pressure influenced the decision. The United Arab Emirates initiated international arbitration proceedings, resulting in a $200 million fine against Djibouti that the government has refused to pay. The incident highlighted the complex interactions between Chinese investment, domestic sovereignty, and international commercial relationships. The debt sustainability challenges became acute by 2022, when Djibouti suspended debt repayments to China after servicing costs tripled due to global economic conditions. The government subsequently negotiated a debt service moratorium with Chinese creditors, though the terms of these arrangements remain largely confidential. International observers worry that Djibouti could face the same fate as Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, which was leased to Chinese companies for 99 years after debt repayment difficulties. Despite these financial challenges, Chinese investments have generated substantial economic benefits, with Djibouti's GDP doubling from $2 billion in 2013 to $4 billion in 2023. The new infrastructure has enhanced Djibouti's capacity to serve as Ethiopia's primary maritime gateway, while positioning the country to capitalize on growing trade between Africa and Asia. The presence of multiple foreign military bases has created unique diplomatic challenges, as Djibouti must balance competing interests of powers that view each other as strategic rivals. The proximity of Chinese and American military installations, separated by only a few miles, has generated tensions that occasionally surface in public disputes over flight patterns, construction activities, and intelligence gathering operations. President Guelleh has navigated these challenges by emphasizing Djibouti's neutrality and the mutual benefits of hosting multiple powers simultaneously. His government argues that foreign military bases contribute to regional security by deterring piracy, terrorism, and interstate conflicts while generating revenue that supports national development. This position requires constant diplomatic balancing, as demonstrated during conflicts where different foreign partners have supported opposing sides. Domestically, President Guelleh's long tenure has consolidated presidential power while maintaining the ethnic balancing arrangements inherited from Hassan Gouled's era. The ruling People's Rally for Progress continues to dominate electoral politics, though constitutional reforms in 2010 eliminated presidential term limits that would have prevented Guelleh from seeking additional terms. Opposition parties frequently boycott elections, arguing that the playing field is tilted decisively in favor of the ruling party. The constitutional changes, allowing unlimited presidential terms, sparked protests in 2010 and 2011, part of the broader Arab Spring movement that affected North Africa and the Middle East. However, these demonstrations were quickly suppressed, with opposition leaders arrested and international observers restricted. President Guelleh has since been re-elected in 2011, 2016, and 2021, typically receiving over 90% of votes cast amid opposition boycotts. In 2024, Parliament removed the constitutional age limit of 75 years that would have prevented Guelleh, now 77, from seeking a sixth term in 2026. This decision, criticized by opposition groups as preparation for presidency for life, reflects the consolidation of power around Gwelier's leadership that has characterized modern Djiboutian politics. The political system's authoritarian characteristics have been documented by international human rights organizations, which cite restrictions on freedom of assembly, press censorship, arbitrary detention of opposition figures, and limitations on civil society organizations. The United States State Department's human rights reports consistently identify significant problems with democratic governance, though these concerns are balanced against strategic interests in maintaining military base access. Economic development under President Gwele has focused heavily on infrastructure and logistics services, with limited diversification into manufacturing or other sectors. The service sector, dominated by port operations and foreign military bases, accounts for approximately 85% of GDP, making the economy highly vulnerable to external shocks affecting trade or international relations. Unemployment remains high, particularly among youth, despite overall economic growth. Climate change poses increasingly serious challenges for Djibouti's development, with rising temperatures, declining rainfall, and more frequent droughts affecting both agricultural productivity and water security. The country imports approximately 70% of its electricity from Ethiopia, creating energy dependencies that became apparent in 2019, when Ethiopian hydroelectric generation declined due to drought conditions. Water scarcity represents perhaps the most serious long-term challenge facing modern Djibouti, with the country importing over 100,000 cubic meters annually from Ethiopia, while struggling to develop domestic sources. Desalination facilities provide some relief, but their energy requirements create additional dependencies on imported electricity or expensive fossil fuels. Regional developments continue to affect Djibouti's strategic position, particularly Ethiopia's efforts to diversify its port access through agreements with Somaliland, Eritrea, and other neighbors. The January 2024 Memorandum of Understanding between Ethiopia and Somaliland, potentially providing Ethiopia with naval access in exchange for recognition of Somaliland's independence, threatens Djibouti's near monopoly over Ethiopian trade. President Gwele has responded to these challenges by deepening Djibouti's integration into regional organizations, currently serving as chairman of the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, while hosting its headquarters. His government actively mediates regional conflicts, including ongoing efforts to support peace processes in Somalia and Sudan. These diplomatic initiatives enhance Djibouti's reputation as a stabilizing force while creating additional sources of international legitimacy. The recent appointment of Djibouti's Foreign Minister Mahmoud Ali Yusuf as chairman of the African Union Commission in 2025 represents a significant diplomatic achievement that enhances the country's continental influence. This position provides opportunities to shape African policy on issues ranging from climate adaptation to Chinese investment, while raising Djibouti's international profile. Looking toward the future, Djibouti faces fundamental questions about the sustainability of its current development model. The country's strategic value appears unlikely to diminish given ongoing global competition for influence in the Horn of Africa and broader Middle East. However, managing relationships with multiple great powers while maintaining domestic stability and addressing development challenges requires increasingly sophisticated governance capabilities. The debt burden from Chinese investments will require careful management to avoid the loss of sovereignty over critical infrastructure, while demographic pressures and climate change create additional urgency for economic diversification and environmental adaptation. Whether future leadership can maintain the delicate balances that have enabled Djibouti's remarkable transformation while addressing these emerging challenges will determine the country's trajectory in an increasingly complex global environment. As we conclude our journey through Djibouti's remarkable history, from ancient Punt civilization to modern strategic crossroads, the constants remain striking: geographic advantage, cultural adaptability, and political sophistication that enables survival and prosperity despite challenging circumstances. The tiny nation that French colonial administrators once viewed as a strategic afterthought has become essential real estate in 21st century great power competition, demonstrating that in international relations, location and leadership often matter more than size and resources. Djibouti's story reminds us that even the smallest nations can shape global affairs when they understand their advantages and navigate international complexities with skill and determination. Whether this success story continues will depend on future generations' ability to maintain the careful balance between opportunity and independence that has characterized this remarkable country's modern development.